When you picture, like, the death of a democracy, what do you actually see? You probably picture a violent military coup.
Right, like tanks rolling down the street or something.
Exactly. Generals taking over the airwaves. But here is a terrifying historical reality check for you. Adolf Hitler didn't arrive in a tank.
No, he really didn't.
His rise to an absolute dictatorship actually began right through the ballot box. I mean, he consolidated his political influence after winning 36.8% of the vote in Germany back in 1932.
Right, the absolute dictatorship came afterward.
Yeah, exactly. And so that brings us to the core question of today's deep dive. Why do voters willingly give away their own power?
Honestly, it is the defining question of modern civics. And to figure it out, well, we are digging into a pretty sweeping historical framework today.
We definitely are. So if you are a student navigating a U.S. history or civics course, especially, those of you in grades 9 through 14, or if you're an educator looking for fresh ways to explain political polarization, this deep dive is specifically for you.
It's a great resource.
It really is. We are unpacking the book Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by historian Heather Cox Richardson. And our mission today is to take her, incredibly broad narrative of American history and just distill it into a clear, engaging overview of how democratic systems fracture and ultimately how they are rebuilt.
And right up front, I think we really need to set the ground rules for our journey today.
Good idea.
Because this book deals heavily with modern, highly charged political topics. I mean, the author covers both left-wing and right-wing political movements, and she makes some very definitive, strong arguments about recent events.
Right.
So, as your guides today, our job is strictly to report on the ideas contained in the original source material. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the author's viewpoints. We're just here to examine the specific structural framework Richardson uses, so that you can clearly understand the arguments she is presenting.
Exactly. We're just laying it out for you to analyze. Okay, let's unpack this framework. Because to understand her view of our current political fractures, we have to start with her thesis on how authoritarians gain traction in the first place.
Yeah, and Richardson argues that authoritarianism doesn't just happen in a vacuum. A strong man usually rises when economic, social, or political changes make a formerly powerful group feel as if they've been totally left behind.
Or marginalized in some way.
Right. And the sense of loss makes them extremely vulnerable. So a strongman figure emerges and uses this highly emotional language, and often a deeply sanitized, completely false version of history, to insist that this group was cheated out of their rightful place by perceived enemies.
And crucially, they don't actually offer real policy solutions to fix those complex economic problems, right? Like, that's not the point.
No, policy really isn't the point at all. The goal is to organize those frustrated followers into a mass movement. A movement where absolute loyalty to the leader becomes central to their very identity.
Wow, so the leader just becomes the only solution.
Exactly.
But the U.S. actually faced this exact same pressure back in the 1930s. I mean, the Great Depression wiped out wealth, people were desperate, and authoritarianism was, like, sweeping across Europe.
It was a very dangerous time.
But the U.S. managed to avoid that fate. Instead of embracing a fascist strongman, the country got Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he rallied Americans around the language of the Declaration of Independence and pushed through the New Deal.
Right, and that specific era birthed what Richardson calls the liberal consensus. And this is a massive concept in the book.
Okay, let's get into that.
It wasn't just like a Democratic Party platform. It actually became this huge bipartisan agreement that governed the country for decades. The liberal consensus held that the federal government had a duty to regulate business, provide a basic social safety net like Social Security, build public infrastructure, and protect civil rights.
It sounds like a pretty fundamental shift.
It was. It was a shift toward a government that actively responded to the everyday needs of ordinary Americans.
Okay, but I'm struggling with the timeline here a little bit. If the liberal consensus was so incredibly popular, I mean, it bankrolled World War II, it built the interstate highway system, it created this booming middle class, why would anyone actually oppose it?
You'd think everyone would be on board.
Right. It sounds like a civic golden age, like everyone getting a slice of a rapidly growing pie.
You would think so, but the book argues that the opposition formed almost immediately, like right away. It was rooted in a very deep desire to maintain traditional hierarchies. The backlash officially kicked off in 1937 with a document called the Conservative Manifesto.
Wait, 1937? that early.
Yes, incredibly early. It was drafted by a coalition of segregationist Southern Democrats and pro-business Republicans.
Oh, interesting combination.
Yeah, well, the Southern Democrats hated that New Deal programs were not overtly segregationist. They feared federal overreach into their local racial hierarchies. And the pro-business Republicans, they just detested the new business regulations and labor protections.
So they teamed up.
Exactly. Together, they circulated this manifesto, arguing that a government answering directly to the needs of ordinary Americans was a dangerous radical experiment. They basically wanted to return to a system where business was totally unchecked and local, state-level social hierarchies were securely maintained.
Okay, but how does a fringe manifesto from 1937 turn into a modern political strategy? I mean, to get rid of massively popular social programs, you need votes.
Right, you need a lot of votes.
You can't exactly run a campaign saying, hey, vote for me, I want to take away your Social Security and make sure big business can do whatever it wants. No one is voting for that.
No, they definitely aren't. And that brings us to the two main tactics Richardson identifies. First, redefining political terminology, and second, identifying a common, terrifying other to distract the voting public.
Okay, break that down for us.
Let's look at the word conservative. Historically, going all the way back to the 18th century Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke, conservatism actually meant promoting stability. It meant actively avoiding radical, ideology-driven changes.
The book even points out that Abraham Lincoln claimed the conservative mantle in 1860, right?
He did, yeah.
Because he argued that fighting the spread of slavery was actually adhering to the founders' original principles. And he framed the pro-slavery advocates as the dangerous radicals who were trying to invent a new system.
That's exactly right. But Richardson contends that the post-1930s movement, which branded itself movement conservatism, was not conservative in that historical sense at all.
Not at all.
She argues they were actually radicals. Their explicit goal was to overturn the highly popular liberal consensus. And to achieve this, the political strategists realized they had to completely change the rules of the debate.
How so?
Well, the book points to figures like William F. Buckley. He realized that if you argue policy facts, like, say, the economic benefits of building infrastructure, you will always lose to the liberal consensus. So he advocated for a new orthodoxy.
An orthodoxy based on what?
Based on free markets and traditional religion.
Yeah.
Basically pushing back against fact-based arguments altogether.
So what does this all mean? It's basically just misdirection. If you can't win on the math, you change the subject.
That's exactly.
It's totally like a magician on stage. They say, look over here at this terrifying cultural threat, while they quietly change the economic rules right behind your back.
That is a fantastic way to visualize it. And the book traces how this misdirection really evolved into a science. It highlights Barry Goldwater's 1960 book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which brilliantly married the hatred of business regulation with opposition to civil rights.
Wow.
But the true mechanical shift, according to the text, happened with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy.
Okay, yes, let's pause here. Break that down for us, because that term gets thrown around a lot in civics and history classes. How did the Southern strategy actually work?
Well, following the Civil Rights Act, you could no longer use overtly racist language in politics without alienating the mainstream public. It just wouldn't work. The Southern strategy was the realization that you could use coded language to achieve the exact same ends.
Like dog whistles.
Right. You stop talking about race entirely, and you start talking about abstract concepts like states' rights or forced busing or tax cuts.
Even though the underlying policies still heavily impacted minority communities?
Exactly. They protected traditional local hierarchies, but the language gave voters plausible deniability. It created this other, just a nebulous threat to traditional American life, to stoke fear among white voters.
And the book argues this really culminated in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, who fully married this political movement to religious fundamentalism.
Yes, very successfully.
But there is a really specific mechanical change the book highlights during the Reagan era that totally altered how we consume information. And that's the end of the fairness doctrine.
Oh, this is a critical piece of the puzzle. So before 1987, the Federal Communications Commission actually enforced the fairness doctrine. This required broadcasters to present contrasting, balanced views on controversial issues of public importance.
So it forced a level of objectivity.
Yeah, it kept the media relatively anchored to a shared set of facts. But when the Reagan administration abolished it, it just paved the way for highly partisan media. You no longer had to present the other side at all.
Which completely changes the landscape.
Totally. It allowed for the creation of massive echo chambers. first on talk radio and then later on cable news. And in these spaces, the orthodoxy that Buckley dreamed of could be repeated endlessly without any friction from counterarguments.
I want to push that magician analogy even further here, because the book makes it very clear that the rhetoric and the media are just the distraction.
Right, the smoke and mirrors.
Exactly. While the audience is totally distracted by the culture wars, the political minority is actually walking into the House and systematically removing the load-bearing walls of the democracy. Richardson claims that once the narrative was established, this movement began physically altering the machinery of government to maintain power, even when they didn't have a majority of the votes.
And this is where the text really moves from ideology to raw political mechanics. Like, how do you rule if you don't have the numbers?
Right, how do you do it?
You skew the system. The author points specifically to an initiative called Operation RDMA back in 2010.
Oh, man. If you have ever looked at a modern voting district map and wondered why it looks like a Rorschach test or like a random splatter of paint, this is why. Explain how Red DMAP worked.
Well, 2010 was a census year, which means all the congressional districts were about to be redrawn. Political strategists realized that if they focused massive resources on taking over state legislatures that specific year, they would actually control the pens that drew those maps.
That's terrifyingly smart.
It was a highly calculated strategy to heavily gerrymander districts. The mechanics are simple but devastating. You pack as many opposing voters as possible into just a few districts, so they win by massive margins but get way fewer seats overall. And then you crack the rest of the opposing voters across multiple districts, so they're always a permanent minority.
So the result is that a party can win a minority of the statewide vote, but somehow secure a supermajority of the political seats.
Exactly. It is mathematically securing minority rule.
No.
And it wasn't just the voting maps they targeted, it was the courts, too.
Yeah, the judges.
The book details this decades-long, highly organized effort to pack the federal courts with originalist judges.
And just for a quick refresher, originalism is the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted exactly as it was understood at the time it was written, right?
Right. And Richardson argues that originalism is used strategically as a tool to strip away modern federal protections. Because think about it, if a right wasn't explicitly recognized back in 1787, an originalist framework can be used to argue it literally doesn't exist, which effectively returns all that power to the individual states.
And the book explicitly frames Donald Trump's presidency as the culmination of this entire movement.
Yes, she sees it as a direct result.
It's not an anomaly to her, it's the destination. She notes his strategist, Steve Bannon, publicly stated his goal was the deconstruction of the administrative state. Like, they explicitly wanted to dismantle the very federal agencies that made up that liberal consensus.
Right, the agencies regulating business and protecting rights.
And the text reports that Trump's rhetoric successfully appealed to voters who were craving a return to a traditional hierarchy led by white men.
And in analyzing the modern era, the author synthesizes several recent events to prove her thesis. She points to the violence at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, drawing a historical line between that and past anti-government violence.
In the impeachments.
Yeah, she frames the first impeachment regarding Ukraine as a fundamental abuse of power to target a political rival. She also discusses the administration's attempts to actively rewrite history, specifically citing the 1776 Commission.
Right, the 1776 Commission. That was created as a direct counter to the 1619 Project, right? The book argues it was an attempt to promote this highly sanitized, mythic version of the nation's founding that completely ignored the deep structural inequalities.
Furthermore, Richardson points to the January 6th Capitol riot, the persistence of the big lie regarding the 2020 election results, and the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade.
That's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. But she frames all of these not as isolated incidents. She sees them as explicit, connected attempts to undermine the democratic process and roll back rights that the national majority actually supports.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This is the massive historical pattern the author draws that just blew my mind. She isn't just looking at the Trump era or the Reagan era in a vacuum. She connects the elite enslavers of the 1850s to the anti-New Dealers in the 1930s, right up to modern political figures. The book argues they all use the exact same playbook.
Yeah, they do.
They all claim that true democracy resides in states' rights.
And why do you think that is the constant through line?
Because a national majority usually favors equality. Like, the national majority supported abolition, they supported the New Deal, they supported the Civil Rights Act. If you are a local minority trying to maintain a hierarchy that the rest of the country hates, you have to localize the power. States' rights is literally the mechanism they use to avoid the oversight of the national majority. It just allows a local minority to enforce a strict social hierarchy.
That is a brilliant distillation of her structural argument. The insistence on states' rights is consistently used as a shield against the federal enforcement of equality. But, after outlining all these persistent, centuries-long forces trying to undermine democracy, the book actually makes a massive pivot.
And it is a deeply hopeful one, which I appreciated.
Very much so. The final section focuses entirely on how democracy has managed to persist despite all of this, and crucially, how it can be reclaimed.
It's a much-needed pivot. The author argues that America's true history is not some flawless mythic past. Like, the founders did not just hand down a perfect system on stone tablets.
Far from it.
The true history of America is the gritty, dangerous, and constant struggle of marginalized people demanding that the nation actually honor its own promises.
She highlights some really specific, powerful individuals who forced the country to live up to its ideals. Take the tragic case of Isaac Woodard.
Remind us of his story.
He was a decorated Black World War II veteran returning home in 1946. While he was still in his military uniform, he was brutally beaten and permanently blinded by a local police chief in South Carolina.
And the state completely refused to hold the officer accountable, which, perfectly illustrates that exact danger of unchecked local power we just talked about.
Exactly. But the national outrage over Woodard's blinding was so intense that it pushed President Harry Truman, who had previously been pretty cautious on civil rights, to actively use the federal government to protect Black Americans.
Wow.
Woodard's tragedy literally forced the federal machinery to move. The book also highlights Rosa Parks.
Yeah, we often hear this really sanitized version of her story, right? That she was just a tired seamstress who didn't want to give up her seat.
Right. But Richardson notes that long before the bus boycott, Parks was actually an active investigator for the NAACP. She bravely traveled around the South for years to document racial assaults.
That's incredible. And Fannie Lou Hamer, a former sharecropper who endured severe police beatings and risked her life simply to organize Black voters in Mississippi and demand access to the ballot box. Like, these are the people who actually built the democracy we have today.
They absolutely are.
The book also totally reevaluates Abraham Lincoln's role in this struggle, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, Lincoln is usually remembered solely for the Civil War, but Richardson highlights his profound innovation in how we even view the role of government itself. Before Lincoln, the government's primary role was seen mostly as just protecting property, which obviously heavily favored the wealthy elite.
Right.
Lincoln fundamentally shifted that. He believed the government should actively give ordinary people access to resources so they could work hard and rise up.
He implemented the Homestead Act, which, gave federal land to Western settlers, and the Land-Grant College Act, which established state universities. He basically invented the idea of the government actively fostering equality of opportunity.
He did. But this raises a pretty glaring question that we definitely have to address. How do the founders fit into this framework?
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room.
If the true history of America is the struggle of marginalized groups fighting for basic rights, and the founders themselves were deeply flawed. Many of them were enslavers who intentionally excluded women, Black Americans, and indigenous people from the democratic process entirely. How does Richardson reconcile their legacy?
Well, the book argues that equality isn't a destination we magically arrived at back in 1776. It is a muscle.
Yeah.
It is a constant, active process, and if you don't flex it, it atrophies.
And her conclusion regarding the founders is just fascinating. She argues that regardless of their massive personal hypocrisies, the founders wrote a mathematical constant into the Declaration of Independence.
The self-evident truth that all men are created equal.
Yes. Even though they completely failed to live up to it in their own time, they enshrined that radical idea into the nation's foundational code.
It's almost like they built a back door into a computer program. Like, they built an elite system, but they left a line of code that could be used to hack it later.
That's a really perfect way to look at it. That principle, that all people are created equal, became the ultimate tool that future generations use to dismantle the very authoritarian hierarchies the founders themselves participated in.
Wow.
The principle just transcended the flawed men who wrote it.
And that brings everything right back to you listening to this right now, especially for the students and educators out there navigating civics and U.S. history. This book serves as a potent reminder that you are not just studying a dead past. You are studying a living, breathing system.
A system that requires participation,
Exactly. The history of American democracy proves that when people wake up, when they organize, and when they actually work together across their communities, they possess the mechanical power to force the country to live up to its highest ideals. The system is fundamentally designed to be pushed forward.
That is the ultimate takeaway of Richardson's work. Democracy is an action. It's not a state of being. And it leaves us with a pretty profound thought to consider as we wrap up today.
Let's hear it.
If democracy is never truly finished, if it must be constantly expanded and defended by every single new generation, what is the glaring blind spot regarding human equality that exists in our society right now?
Yeah. What is the self-evident truth that we are currently ignoring, which the students of tomorrow will be forced to fight for? It is a question that requires some really deep reflection from all of us, because as the book reminds us right at the very beginning, the threat to democracy rarely announces itself with the rumble of military tanks.
No, it doesn't.
The true test of our vigilance always happens quietly, right there at the ballot box.